Long before the United States existed, long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, and long before anyone could imagine a nation called America, people were already living across the vast landscape of North America. They moved through forests, plains, deserts, mountains, river valleys, and coastlines, learning the rhythms of seasons and building communities adapted to very different environments. Their history did not begin with the arrival of Europeans. It began thousands of years earlier with migration, survival, cooperation, invention, and memory.
The earliest inhabitants of North America did not leave behind modern cities or written chronicles that tell us exactly what happened. Instead, their history survives in archaeological sites, stone tools, bones, seeds, pottery, earthworks, buildings, oral traditions, languages, and landscapes that still carry traces of human activity. Archaeologists have learned that the absence of written records does not mean the absence of complex societies. People who left no written books could still possess extraordinary knowledge of plants, animals, weather, geography, astronomy, engineering, and social organization.
For early communities, knowledge was a form of survival. A person needed to remember where fish appeared during particular seasons, where edible plants could be found, which valleys offered shelter, and which rivers could be traveled safely. Older generations passed this information to younger ones through stories, demonstrations, ceremonies, and everyday practice. A landscape was therefore not simply a collection of natural resources. It was a living archive of memory. Every river, mountain, hunting ground, and settlement could have a history. North America was never one uniform environment. The continent contained enormous differences in climate and geography, and those differences encouraged many different ways of life. In the far north, communities learned to survive in severe cold and depend heavily on marine resources. Along the Pacific coast, abundant fish and forests supported communities with relatively stable food supplies. In the Great Plains, people adapted to vast grasslands and changing animal populations. In the Southwest, water management became essential. In the eastern woodlands, agriculture, hunting, fishing, and gathering existed together. Agriculture gradually transformed many parts of the continent. Growing crops did not immediately replace hunting or gathering, and farming communities often continued to depend on wild foods. But agriculture created the possibility of storing food and remaining in one place for longer periods. Permanent or semi-permanent settlements could become larger. Houses became more substantial, storage facilities became important, and communities developed new ways to organize labor. Once people lived together in larger numbers, questions of leadership, property, ritual, and conflict became increasingly important. Corn, beans, and squash became especially important in many eastern and central regions. These crops could complement one another and provide a relatively reliable food base. Agriculture did more than produce calories. It created surplus food that could support people who specialized in crafts, trade, construction, religion, or political leadership. In this way, farming could contribute to increasingly complex societies. Yet agricultural success always depended on local climate, soil, rainfall, and human knowledge. There was no single agricultural model across the continent. One of the most remarkable developments in ancient North America was the growth of long-distance trade. Communities exchanged materials that were not naturally available in their own regions. Shells, stone, minerals, copper, pigments, pottery, food products, and ceremonial objects traveled across surprisingly large distances. Trade carried more than objects. It carried ideas, artistic styles, stories, technologies, and relationships. A person could live far from the ocean and still possess a shell from the coast. A tool made from distant stone could reveal the existence of a network connecting communities hundreds of miles apart. The Mississippi River system became one of the great corridors of ancient North America. Rivers provided transportation, food, fertile soil, and connections between ecological regions. Along these waterways, populations grew and cultural networks expanded. One of the most famous centers was Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. At its height, Cahokia was a major urban and ceremonial center with enormous earthen mounds, plazas, residential areas, and evidence of extensive regional connections. It demonstrated that large-scale social organization existed in North America long before European colonization. The Great Mounds of Cahokia were not simply piles of earth. They required planning, labor, food, transportation, and leadership. Someone had to decide where to build, organize workers, move enormous quantities of soil, maintain public spaces, and support the people involved. Monumental construction is therefore evidence of social organization. A mound tells us not only about architecture, but also about the political and religious systems that made the architecture possible.
Cahokia also reminds us that ancient cities were places of ordinary life. Behind the monumental structures were families preparing food, children growing up, craftspeople making tools, traders arriving from distant regions, farmers working fields, and religious specialists conducting ceremonies. Archaeology often shows us walls, foundations, pottery fragments, and soil layers, but behind those physical traces were thousands of individual lives. A city is not truly understood until its buildings are imagined as spaces where people lived, worked, argued, celebrated, and raised children.
In the Southwest, ancient communities faced a very different challenge. Water was limited, rainfall could be unpredictable, and agriculture required careful adaptation. Communities associated with ancestral Pueblo traditions developed sophisticated architecture and methods of managing scarce resources. Cliff dwellings, masonry structures, storage rooms, and ceremonial spaces reveal long-term investment in particular landscapes. Their achievements demonstrate that advanced engineering does not always require modern materials. It can emerge from deep knowledge of local stone, weather, terrain, and water.
The architecture of the Southwest also reveals that ancient settlements were social worlds. A room was not merely a shelter. It could be part of a household, a storage system, a ceremonial complex, or a larger community. Buildings were connected to food production, family life, religion, and political relationships. When settlements changed or populations moved, those changes were often responses to a combination of environmental pressure, social transformation, and changing regional relationships. In the eastern woodlands, many societies combined farming with hunting, fishing, and gathering. Seasonal rhythms shaped economic life. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter offered different resources, and communities developed flexible strategies for using them. Political relationships were also flexible. Villages could cooperate, trade, intermarry, compete, or fight. Diplomacy and conflict were not opposites. They were part of the same political landscape. Alliances could change as circumstances changed. The Haudenosaunee, known in English as the Iroquois Confederacy, developed an influential political system based on cooperation among several nations. Their institutions demonstrated that political complexity did not require a European-style monarchy or modern state. Negotiation, councils, kinship, diplomacy, and collective decision-making could create durable political relationships. European observers sometimes misunderstood these institutions because they tried to fit them into familiar categories. To understand such societies, it is necessary to begin with their own historical and cultural logic. Land was understood in different ways by different societies. Modern people often think of land primarily as private property that can be bought and sold. Many indigenous societies had more complex relationships with territory. Particular areas could be associated with families, communities, seasonal use, hunting rights, ceremonial traditions, burial places, or ancestral memory. This difference became increasingly important after European colonization. A European colonist might see an unfenced area as unused land, while an indigenous community could understand the same landscape as an actively managed and deeply meaningful homeland. This difference in the meaning of land would become one of the deepest sources of conflict in American history. European colonial governments increasingly used surveys, maps, deeds, boundaries, and private ownership to define territory.
Indigenous communities often had different systems of land use and political authority. Neither side entered the encounter with an empty understanding of territory. They carried different legal and cultural assumptions, and those assumptions often collided.
Then, the Atlantic world began to change dramatically. European voyages connected North America to a rapidly expanding network linking Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. The arrival of Europeans brought new animals, weapons, tools, diseases, religions, economic systems, and political ambitions. It also brought enormous demographic consequences. Diseases to which indigenous populations had little previous exposure could spread rapidly, causing catastrophic population losses in some regions. Disease was one of the most powerful forces in the transformation of early North America. Epidemics could kill large portions of communities before European settlement became extensive in a region. When populations collapsed, political alliances changed, agricultural systems weakened, and territories could be occupied by others. The consequences were often indirect. A disease did not need to have a political intention to change the balance of power. Biology itself became a historical force. European colonial powers did not enter North America in the same way. Spain established settlements and missions in the South and Southwest. France developed extensive relationships around the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence, and the Mississippi system, with trade playing a major role. The English established increasingly large agricultural colonies along the Atlantic coast. The Dutch also developed important commercial interests. These empires competed with one another, and indigenous nations became active participants in the changing balance of power. Colonial North America was therefore not simply a story of Europeans acting and indigenous people reacting. Indigenous nations made strategic decisions. They negotiated treaties, formed alliances, traded goods, adopted technologies, resisted settlement, moved communities, and sometimes used European rivalries to protect their own interests. The colonial world was a complicated political environment in which no group possessed complete control. The Atlantic economy grew rapidly. Tobacco, fish, timber, grain, furs, and other products moved across the ocean. Colonial ports became connected to European markets and Caribbean plantations. Ships carried not only goods, but also information, political instructions, religious ideas, and people. North America was becoming part of an early form of globalization. A change in European markets could influence farmers thousands of miles away. A war between European powers could reshape colonial trade. But this economic growth was built partly on one of the darkest institutions in American history, slavery. Enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic and compelled to work under brutal conditions. In plantation regions, slavery became deeply integrated into agriculture, wealth, law, and political power. Enslaved people were treated as property by law. Families could be separated, education was restricted, and violence was used to maintain control. Yet enslaved people were never simply passive victims. They preserved families, communities, religious traditions, music, language, and cultural practices while resisting oppression in countless ways. The history of slavery is essential to understanding the development of the United States because it was not a side institution. It affected land, labor, trade, politics, law, and wealth. Cotton later became one of the most important export commodities in the American economy, and its production depended heavily on enslaved labor. The prosperity of some regions was therefore directly connected to a system that denied freedom to millions of people. Colonial society also developed its own political habits. Many settlers became accustomed to local assemblies, town meetings, and forms of self-government. They still considered themselves part of the British Empire, but they increasingly developed a distinct political identity. When the British government attempted to strengthen imperial control and taxation after the 7 Years' War, resistance grew. The dispute was not simply about a tax on tea or other individual measures. Beneath those conflicts were larger questions about representation, sovereignty, and the limits of imperial authority. The American Revolution transformed the political landscape, but independence did not immediately create equality. The new republic spoke the language of liberty and natural rights, while excluding large portions of its population from full political participation. Women had limited political rights. Enslaved people remained enslaved. Indigenous nations faced growing pressure, and voting was often restricted by property or other requirements. This contradiction would become one of the central themes of American history. The ideals of freedom repeatedly collided with the realities of exclusion. The creation of the United States also raised a practical problem. Defeating an empire was one task.
Building a stable government was another. The new country had to manage debts, trade, taxation, relations among states, defense, Western territories, and internal disagreements. The Constitution created a stronger federal structure, but it did not eliminate conflict. Instead, it created institutions through which future conflicts could be negotiated. Expansion soon became a defining feature of the Republic. The Louisiana Purchase dramatically increased the territory controlled by the United States, and explorers, settlers, merchants, soldiers, and government officials moved farther west. But the land was not empty. Indigenous nations already lived there, governed territories, cultivated fields, hunted, traded, and maintained political relationships. American expansion therefore meant repeated encounters over sovereignty and land. The idea of the frontier became deeply embedded in American culture. The West was often imagined as a place of opportunity, independence, and renewal. For settlers, new land could indeed mean a chance to build a farm or business. For indigenous communities, however, the same expansion could mean the loss of ancestral territory and political autonomy. For companies, the West meant railroads, mines, timber, and markets. The same landscape represented completely different futures to different people. Transportation transformed the country. Canals and steamboats accelerated commerce in the early 19th century, while railroads later connected distant regions on an unprecedented scale. Farmers could send crops to national markets, manufacturers could distribute goods over long distances, and migrants could move more quickly. The country became increasingly integrated economically. Transportation did not simply connect existing places. It created new towns, industries, and patterns of settlement. The market revolution also changed ordinary life. Families increasingly produced goods for sale rather than only for local consumption. Money, banks, credit, commercial agriculture, and national markets became more important. A farmer in the interior could become dependent on prices determined far away. Economic opportunity increased, but so did economic risk. A financial crisis in a major city could affect workers and farmers in distant regions. The expansion of slavery into new territories intensified political conflict. As the United States acquired and settled more land, politicians repeatedly argued over whether slavery would be allowed in new states and territories. Compromises delayed the crisis, but they did not resolve the underlying disagreement. At the center was not only the future of slavery, but also the meaning of federal power, state sovereignty, and the future direction of the nation. The Civil War became a massive test of whether the United States would remain a single nation and whether slavery would survive. The war caused enormous death and destruction. It transformed the federal government's relationship with the states and ultimately led to the abolition of slavery. Yet, emancipation did not immediately produce racial equality. The post-war period would reveal how difficult it was to transform legal freedom into social and economic freedom. Reconstruction brought constitutional changes and new political possibilities for formerly enslaved people. African Americans gained citizenship and political rights in law, and Black communities built schools, churches, newspapers, businesses, and political organizations. But white resistance was violent and persistent. When federal protection weakened, segregation and disenfranchisement expanded across much of the South. The struggle over the meaning of freedom continued for generations. At the same time, the North and West were undergoing rapid industrialization. Railroads crossed the continent. Steel, oil, manufacturing, and finance expanded. Large corporations emerged, and cities grew rapidly.
The United States was becoming an industrial power. Industrialization created extraordinary wealth and technological change, but it also produced dangerous working conditions, crowded neighborhoods, pollution, and extreme inequality. Workers began organizing in response. They demanded shorter hours, higher wages, safer workplaces, and greater control over their working lives. The 8-hour workday became an important symbol. Industrial society had introduced a new concept of time. The clock could determine a worker's income. Labor movements argued that human life should not be completely controlled by industrial schedules. The struggle over time was really a struggle over dignity and power.
Immigration transformed American cities. Millions of people arrived from Europe and later from other parts of the world. They created neighborhoods, businesses, churches, schools, newspapers, and social organizations. New immigrants supplied labor for factories, mines, construction, agriculture, and transportation. They also brought languages, foods, religious traditions, music, and political ideas. American culture became increasingly diverse, even as immigrants faced discrimination and exclusion. The question of who counted as a real American appeared repeatedly. Each generation of newcomers could be described by some critics as foreign, dangerous, or incapable of assimilation. Yet over time, many communities once considered outsiders became central to American identity. The history of immigration demonstrates that national identity is not fixed. It is constantly being renegotiated as new people enter the society and reshape it. Cities became laboratories of modern life. New York grew as a financial and commercial center. Chicago developed around railroads, grain, meatpacking, and industry. Los Angeles later expanded through transportation, entertainment, manufacturing, and its Pacific location. San Francisco became an important port and eventually a center of technology. Each city followed a different path, but transportation, capital, labor, and geography repeatedly determined urban growth. Agriculture remained crucial even as industry expanded. The Great Plains became one of the world's major agricultural regions. Mechanization increased productivity and allowed fewer farmers to produce more food. Railroads connected farms to cities and global markets. But higher productivity also contributed to rural depopulation. As fewer people were needed on farms, millions moved towards cities and industrial regions. Urbanization was therefore partly a consequence of agricultural success. Energy became another central thread in American development. Wood powered early industries, coal drove railroads and factories, and oil later transformed transportation and manufacturing. Electricity changed cities and households. The automobile linked oil, roads, manufacturing, suburbs, and consumer culture into a single system. Each energy transition created new industries while also creating new environmental and political problems. The automobile changed the geography of the United States. Railroads had connected major cities, but cars allowed individuals to move across local landscapes on their own schedules. Roads expanded, suburbs grew, shopping centers appeared, and urban areas spread outward. American life became increasingly organized around mobility. The car was not simply a machine for transportation. It reshaped housing, employment, commerce, and the physical form of cities.
The early 20th century also brought mass culture. Radio, newspapers, movies, recorded music, and later television created national audiences. People in distant regions could hear the same songs, follow the same political stories, and watch the same stars. A more unified national culture emerged. At the same time, mass media created new forms of advertising and consumer desire, linking identity increasingly to products and lifestyles. The Great Depression revealed the fragility of the industrial economy. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared, and families lost homes and savings. The crisis forced Americans to reconsider the role of government. The New Deal expanded federal involvement in financial regulation, public works, employment, and social security. Government became more directly connected to the economic well-being of ordinary citizens.
World War II transformed the United States again. Factories expanded at extraordinary speed. Millions of people entered military service or war-related industries, and scientific research received enormous resources. The war accelerated developments in aviation, medicine, communications, nuclear technology, and manufacturing. When the war ended, the United States possessed immense industrial and financial power. Its role in world affairs had changed permanently. The post-war period created a new consumer society. Millions of families purchased homes, automobiles, televisions, refrigerators, and other household goods. Suburbs expanded, highways grew, and higher education became accessible to a larger portion of the population. The ideal of middle-class prosperity became central to American culture. Yet the benefits of the post-war boom were not equally distributed. Racial discrimination, segregation, and economic inequality remained powerful barriers.
The civil rights movement challenged those barriers. Black Americans and their allies used protests, boycotts, legal challenges, community organizing, journalism, and political pressure to attack segregation and discrimination. Churches, students, workers, lawyers, and ordinary families all played roles. The movement demonstrated that democracy does not operate only through elections. Organized citizens can pressure institutions to change laws and practices. The struggle for civil rights also revealed the gap between American ideals and American reality. The language of equality had existed for generations, but many people had been denied equal access to voting, education, housing, employment, and public facilities. Civil rights activists forced the country to confront this contradiction. Their efforts helped produce major legal changes, but the broader struggle over equality continued. Women's rights movements also challenged traditional assumptions about citizenship and work. Women increasingly entered universities, professional occupations, and political organizations, while demanding greater control over education, employment, family life, and political participation. Like the civil rights movement, these campaigns showed that social change often begins when people question rules that previous generations treated as normal. The Cold War expanded America's global role. Competition with the Soviet Union affected military policy, science, education, culture, and foreign relations. The space race became a symbol of technological competition. The development of rockets, satellites, computers, communication systems, and advanced materials received enormous investment. Many technologies that later shaped civilian life were connected, directly or indirectly, to this period of intense scientific competition. The American university system became an important part of the innovation economy. Government funding, research universities, private companies, and skilled immigration created networks capable of turning scientific discoveries into commercial technologies. The later rise of the computer industry and Silicon Valley was not the result of one inventor alone. It depended on decades of education, research, investment, engineering, entrepreneurship, and talent migration. The computer revolution changed the meaning of information. Early computers were enormous machines used by governments and large institutions. Over time, computers became smaller, cheaper, and more accessible. Personal computers entered homes and offices. Networks connected them. The internet then transformed communication, commerce, entertainment, and politics. Information could travel globally in seconds, and geography became less important for many forms of economic activity. The digital economy also created new inequalities. Some workers benefited from high-skill technology industries, while others faced declining demand for traditional manufacturing jobs. Entire regions experienced deindustrialization as factories closed or moved. Cities that had once depended on steel, automobiles, textiles, or heavy manufacturing had to search for new economic identities. Technology created enormous wealth, but its benefits were distributed unevenly. Immigration continued to reshape the country in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. New communities from Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and other regions became increasingly visible. American cities became more linguistically and culturally diverse. Restaurants, music, religious institutions, businesses, and schools reflected this transformation.
The United States became not simply a nation of European immigrant descendants, but a much broader global society.
This diversity is one reason American culture is difficult to define as a single tradition. Jazz, blues, rock, hip-hop, country music, film, television, food, literature, and sports all contain layers from different communities. African American creativity has been particularly influential, while indigenous traditions, European immigration, Latin American culture, and Asian American experiences have also shaped the national cultural landscape. American culture is best understood as a continuous process of exchange. Geography still matters in the modern era. The Atlantic and Pacific coasts provide access to global trade. The Mississippi River system connects the interior. The Great Lakes support transportation and industry. The Central Plains support agriculture. The West contains major mineral, energy, and technological resources. Geography does not guarantee prosperity, but it creates possibilities that institutions and technology can develop.
Environmental history reveals another side of development. Forests were cleared, rivers were redirected, mines expanded, oil fields grew, and cities spread across natural landscapes. Industrialization produced enormous economic benefits, while also creating pollution and ecological damage. The environmental movement emerged partly from the recognition that economic growth could not continue without considering long-term consequences. Conservation, national parks, environmental regulations, and renewable energy became part of the national debate. The history of government also shows repeated changes in the relationship between citizens and the state. During war, government expands its ability to mobilize people and resources. During economic crises, governments often take stronger roles in markets and social protection. During periods of social conflict, federal institutions may intervene to enforce rights. The American state is therefore not a fixed structure. Its powers and responsibilities have changed in response to crises and political pressure. American financial history follows a similar pattern. Banks, stock markets, investment firms, and corporations provided capital for railroads, factories, housing, and technology. Financial systems helped the economy grow rapidly, but they also created new forms of risk. The crashes of the 19th and 20th centuries demonstrated that markets could produce both innovation and instability. Regulation developed partly as a response to these repeated crises. The United States also became increasingly connected to the global economy. European wars, Asian economic growth, Middle Eastern energy markets, Latin American trade, and global financial networks all affected American prosperity. The country could no longer be understood as an isolated continental economy. By the 20th century, American economic and political decisions had consequences far beyond its borders, while international events increasingly affected everyday life inside the country. The global influence of American culture grew alongside its economic and military power. Hollywood films, popular music, television, consumer brands, sports, and later internet platforms reached audiences around the world. Yet the culture being exported was itself the product of global influences. American popular culture was never created in isolation. It emerged from the meeting of many communities and traditions inside the country. Regional differences remained important. The Northeast developed strong financial, educational, and commercial centers. The South carried a distinct history shaped by plantation agriculture, slavery, segregation, civil rights, and later industrialization. The Midwest became associated with agriculture and manufacturing. The West developed through mining, ranching, military installations, aerospace, entertainment, and technology. These regions developed different identities, and those identities continue to influence American politics and culture. One of the deepest themes in American history is the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility. American political culture strongly values personal liberty, private property, entrepreneurship, and individual opportunity. At the same time, modern society depends on public schools, roads, courts, infrastructure, social insurance, public health, and national defense. The balance between individual rights and shared responsibilities has never been permanently settled. Technology repeatedly changes the relationship between workers and employers. Agricultural machines reduced the number of people needed on farms. Factory automation transformed manufacturing. Computers changed office work. The internet created new forms of remote and digital employment. Artificial intelligence is now beginning to affect knowledge work. Every technological revolution creates fears of job loss and hopes of new opportunity. History suggests that technology usually changes the structure of work rather than simply eliminating work altogether, but the transition can be painful and unequal.
The history of land also continues into the modern era. Colonial settlement transformed indigenous territories. 19th century expansion redistributed land on a continental scale. Railroads influenced settlement patterns. Urban development increased the value of property around growing cities. Suburbanization transformed farmland into housing. Land has therefore always been both a place to live and a source of wealth. Conflicts over land remain deeply connected to American economic and political life.
If we look at American history through the eyes of ordinary families, the pace of change becomes extraordinary. A colonial family might produce much of its own food. A 19th century immigrant family might live in a crowded urban neighborhood and work in a factory. A 20th century middle-class family might own a car and a television. A 21st century family might depend on smartphones, digital services, global supply chains, and remote communication. Only a few generations separate these worlds. The speed of change has increased dramatically. Ancient societies could remain stable for centuries. Industrial societies could transform within decades. The information age can transform industries within only a few years. Faster change creates opportunities, but also creates pressure. People and institutions must adapt before they fully understand the previous change. The challenge of adaptation has therefore become one of the defining features of modern society.
Looking at the full timeline also changes our understanding of progress. A society without skyscrapers is not necessarily simple. A society without coins can possess complex trade. A society without writing can have sophisticated knowledge. A society without a modern state can have political institutions. Ancient North American societies solved problems according to their own environments and values. Comparing them only with modern industrial standards can hide rather than reveal their achievements.
The indigenous past is therefore not a short prologue to American history. Indigenous nations continued to exist after colonization through displacement, warfare, treaties, boarding schools, economic pressure, and cultural suppression. They also continued to preserve languages, ceremonies, political identities, and relationships to land. In the modern era, indigenous nations continue to pursue sovereignty, cultural preservation, and legal recognition. Their history connects ancient North America directly to the present.
African American history is equally central. From forced migration and slavery to emancipation, Reconstruction, segregation, the Great Migration, the Civil Rights Movement, and the present, Black Americans have shaped the country's economy, culture, politics, and identity. American music, literature, religion, food, sports, and political thought would be fundamentally different without African American contributions. The history of the United States cannot be separated from the history of Black America. Immigrant history also shows that American identity is continually rebuilt. New arrivals often experience poverty, prejudice, and cultural uncertainty. They create communities that provide language, jobs, housing, religion, and social support. Their children often move between inherited traditions and American institutions. Over time, the boundary between immigrant culture and American culture becomes difficult to separate. What once seemed foreign can become ordinary.
This process explains why the American city is one of the most visible products of history. A modern city may contain layers from indigenous occupation, colonial settlement, industrial development, immigration, suburbanization, and the digital economy. Roads may follow old geographic routes. Neighborhoods may preserve immigrant histories. Industrial buildings may become technology offices or apartments. The city is a physical record of economic and social change. The same is true of the countryside.
A modern farm may sit on land once managed through indigenous ecological practices, later surveyed by a government, granted or sold to settlers, connected to a railroad, mechanized in the 20th century, and integrated into global markets. The landscape looks stable, but its meaning has changed repeatedly.
The United States is therefore best understood as a layered society. Each period leaves institutions and memories that influence the next. Colonial legal traditions influenced the Republic. Revolutionary ideas influenced later reform movements. Slavery shaped the economy and the Civil War. Industrialization shaped cities and labor politics. Immigration shaped culture. Cold War research shaped technology. The digital revolution is now shaping a new economy. Nothing arrives from nowhere. The same lesson applies to political institutions. The federal government began with limited capacity compared with the modern state. Over time, taxation, administration, military organization, infrastructure, regulation, and social programs expanded. Crises often accelerated these changes. Stronger government created greater capacity to act, but it also raised new questions about accountability, individual rights, and the limits of state power.
American history is therefore not a straight line from weakness to strength. There were periods of expansion and periods of collapse, moments of optimism and moments of fear, reforms and reversals. Cahokia rose and declined. Colonial towns grew and changed. Industrial cities prospered and later lost factories. New technologies created industries while destroying older ones. Development is not permanent upward movement. It is continuous adjustment. The Civil War, for example, was both a national catastrophe and a transformation. The abolition of slavery was a historic change, but Reconstruction did not create immediate equality. Industrialization produced enormous wealth, but also dangerous working conditions. Immigration expanded the economy, but generated exclusionary movements. Technological progress improved living standards, but created environmental costs. American history repeatedly shows that benefits and costs can arrive together.
This complexity is why historical storytelling should avoid turning the past into either a perfect success story or a simple story of failure. The United States produced extraordinary economic and technological achievements, while also carrying the legacies of dispossession, slavery, racism, inequality, and war. These realities are not mutually exclusive. A mature understanding of history must be able to hold them together. The deepest question is not simply why the United States became powerful. It is how power was built, who benefited from it, who paid its costs, and how institutions changed in response. Land, labor, capital, technology, population, law, and global events all mattered. But behind every system were people making choices, adapting to circumstances, cooperating, resisting, and imagining different futures. That is why the history of America is also a history of choices. Settlers chose where to build communities. Governments chose how to distribute land. Politicians chose compromises or confrontation. Workers chose whether to organize. Migrants chose where to settle. Scientists chose what to study. Citizens chose whether to accept or challenge existing institutions. History was never completely predetermined. The same is true today. The modern United States faces new questions about technology, artificial intelligence, energy, climate, inequality, immigration, political institutions, and global competition. Future historians may look back on the early 21st century as another turning point. The technologies and decisions of our time will shape the society that comes after us.
If future historians study our age, they may face a strange problem. We are producing enormous quantities of information, but digital information is not necessarily permanent. Websites disappear, storage devices fail, software formats become obsolete, and digital records can be lost. Future researchers may have to reconstruct our world from fragments, just as archaeologists reconstruct ancient societies from pottery,
buildings, bones, and soil. That thought places our own lives in perspective. The people of ancient North America did not know that future generations would study their homes and tools. They were simply living. The same is true of us. We may not think of our daily decisions as historical, but they are becoming part of the record that future generations will inherit.
When we stand at an ancient mound or a cliff dwelling, it is easy to imagine that the people who lived there belonged to a completely different world. In material terms, they did. But in human terms, the distance is smaller. They needed food, shelter, family, cooperation, security, meaning, and hope. Modern Americans need the same basic things, even though the systems used to obtain them are vastly more complicated. This is perhaps the most important connection between ancient North America and modern America. Technology changes faster than human needs. The tools change, the institutions change, and the scale of society changes. But people still face questions about resources, trust, power, identity, belonging, and the future of their children. The American story, therefore, begins before America and continues beyond the present. It begins with human migration and adaptation. It moves through agriculture, trade, settlement, political organization, and cultural diversity. It then enters the Atlantic world of colonization, slavery, disease, and empire. It continues through revolution, independence, territorial expansion, civil war, industrialization, immigration, global conflict, civil rights, and technological transformation. Every stage left something behind. Ancient societies left earthworks, buildings, languages, stories, and cultural traditions. Colonial society left legal institutions, towns, roads, and economic networks. The Republic left constitutional structures. Industrialization left railroads, factories, cities, and labor movements. The 20th century left highways, universities, military institutions, scientific networks, and mass culture. The digital age is leaving another layer of infrastructure and information. Seen from a great distance, the modern United States is only one layer in a much older landscape. State borders are recent, cities are recent, national institutions are recent. Human occupation is ancient. Rivers, mountains, forests, deserts, and coastlines existed long before political boundaries and will likely remain long after particular institutions change. This long perspective makes the idea of a permanent nation seem less certain. No political arrangement lasts forever. Governments change, economic systems change, technologies change, and populations move. A society that appears stable to one generation may look completely different to another. History does not promise permanence. It teaches adaptation. The ancient world offers many examples. Cahokia was once a major center and later declined. Southwestern communities flourished and later moved. Trade networks changed. Political alliances formed and dissolved. None of these transformations meant that human history stopped. People adapted and created new communities. The same principle applies to modern cities and economies.
American cities have already experienced this cycle. Industrial centers once dominated national production. Later, factories closed and populations moved. Some cities reinvented themselves through education, medicine, finance, culture, or technology. Others struggled for decades. Economic geography is never finished. A place that is central in one generation can become peripheral in another. The same uncertainty applies to technology. Railroads once seemed revolutionary. Automobiles later transformed society. Television changed mass communication. Personal computers changed offices. The internet changed information. Smartphones changed daily behavior. Artificial intelligence may now reshape knowledge work. Each generation tends to assume its newest technology is permanent, yet history shows that even revolutionary technologies eventually become ordinary or replaced.
The environment also has a long memory. A river altered for industry may carry traces of centuries of human use. A forest cleared for agriculture may later become a suburb.
A mine may leave a landscape scar long after the company disappears. Modern environmental debates are therefore not only about the future, they are also about recognizing the accumulated consequences of past decisions. Understanding these layers can change the way we look at an ordinary American landscape. A highway may follow an old migration corridor. A city park may contain traces of earlier settlements. A riverfront warehouse district may reflect 19th century trade. A suburban neighborhood may have replaced farmland. A university may stand near the site of an older community. The modern landscape is full of hidden history. This is why historical research often resembles archaeology, even when studying recent periods. Researchers look for fragments.
Census records, newspapers, letters, photographs, maps, business documents, oral histories, buildings, family archives, and government records. Each source is incomplete. The task is to combine them carefully, while recognizing that every source reflects the perspective of the person or institution that created it. The question of perspective is essential. A government report may describe a policy as successful, while a community remembers it as destructive. A company may describe a factory as an engine of progress, while workers remember dangerous conditions. A colonial map may present a territory as empty, while indigenous communities remember generations of occupation. Historical truth becomes clearer when different perspectives are placed beside one another.
This does not mean that every interpretation is equally supported. Evidence still matters. But it means that history becomes richer when researchers ask whose voice is present, whose voice is missing, and why. The American past contains many communities whose experiences were not fully recorded in official documents. Recovering those stories is one of the most important tasks of modern historical scholarship. The story of slavery provides a powerful example. Official economic records may tell us the value of cotton exports or the number of enslaved people on plantations, but they cannot, by themselves, describe the emotional reality of families separated by sale, children growing up under coercion, or communities preserving traditions under threat. Personal narratives, oral traditions, archaeology, and later historical research help bring those human experiences into view.
The history of indigenous peoples presents a similar challenge. Colonial records often described indigenous communities from an outsider's perspective. Modern research increasingly combines archaeological evidence with indigenous knowledge and community perspectives. This approach can reveal that places once described as wilderness were in fact landscapes shaped by generations of human management. The concept as wilderness itself has a history. Forests, grasslands, and wetlands that appear untouched today may have been influenced by controlled burning, seasonal movement, agriculture, hunting, and other practices. Human beings have been part of North American ecosystems for thousands of years. The boundary between nature and society is therefore more complicated than modern categories sometimes suggest.
Modern environmental thinking is beginning to recover some of these insights. Indigenous ecological knowledge can provide information about fire, water, plants, animals, and seasonal cycles. This does not mean ancient practices should be copied without question, but it demonstrates that environmental management has a much longer history than modern conservation institutions. North America has always been a place where people and ecosystems interact. The economic history of America can also be understood through the movement of resources. Timber, fish, farmland, minerals, coal, oil, and later data and intellectual property all became important sources of wealth. The economy changed whenever the value of a resource changed or when new technologies made previously inaccessible resources useful. Resource abundance created opportunities, but it also encouraged exploitation and conflict. Capital transformed those opportunities into large-scale systems. Investors financed canals, railroads, factories, mines, utilities, housing, and technology companies. Financial networks connected distant regions. But capital also concentrated wealth. American history repeatedly shows the tension between entrepreneurial opportunity and unequal accumulation.
Debates about taxation, regulation, labor rights, and corporate power are therefore not new. They have existed since the country's economic institutions began expanding.
Education provided another pathway through which economic change became possible. A society can possess resources, but it needs people who can measure, engineer, organize, teach, manage, and innovate. Public schools expanded literacy. Universities developed professional expertise. Research institutions produced scientific knowledge. Immigration brought additional skills. The American innovation system emerged from the interaction of all these forces rather than from technology alone. The military also influenced technological development. Wars accelerated manufacturing, aviation, communications, medicine, logistics, and computing. Military research later produced technologies that entered civilian life. Yet military power came with enormous human costs. The American experience demonstrates the complicated relationship between technological innovation and conflict. The same scientific system can create tools that save lives and tools designed for destruction. Global leadership brought another contradiction. The United States increasingly promoted ideas about democracy and freedom abroad, while dealing with serious inequalities at home. International reputation and domestic reality did not always match. Civil rights reform therefore had international significance, as well as domestic importance. How the United States treated its own citizens affected how others viewed its political ideals. The long civil rights struggle also demonstrates that legal change and cultural change are different processes. A law can prohibit discrimination, but changing habits, institutions, wealth patterns, and social attitudes can take much longer. The same principle applies to many reforms throughout American history. Political decisions can change the rules quickly. Social transformation often requires generations. The history of women, workers, immigrants, Indigenous peoples, and African Americans therefore reveals a recurring pattern.
Rights expand through pressure, organization, negotiation, and conflict. The expansion is rarely automatic. People organize around specific problems and demand that institutions recognize their claims. The democratic system changes partly because citizens challenge its existing boundaries. This process also creates new debates. When one group gains political power, other groups may fear losing influence. Economic change creates winners and losers. Cultural change can produce excitement and anxiety at the same time. American history is therefore full of moments when people disagree not only about policies, but about what kind of society the country should be. The United States has never had one permanent definition of itself. In the colonial era, identity was tied partly to empire and local community. During the Revolution, Republican citizenship became central. During westward expansion, the frontier became a powerful national symbol. During industrialization, the idea of economic opportunity grew. During the 20th century, mass consumer culture and global leadership became important. In the digital era, technology and diversity have become central parts of national identity. The phrase American dream has also changed because the country itself has changed. Land ownership once represented independence. Later, stable industrial employment and home ownership became symbols of success. In the technology era, entrepreneurship, education, and innovation became increasingly important. Yet the underlying hope remains similar, that the next generation can have greater opportunities than the previous one. Whether that promise is fulfilled has always depended on institutions. Education, labor laws, civil rights protections, infrastructure, markets, immigration policies, and political participation shape who can take advantage of opportunities. Opportunity does not exist only as an abstract idea. It is affected by the rules of society. This is why history matters for the future. If we know how institutions were created, we can better understand why they work in some situations and fail in others. If we know how previous technological transitions affected workers, we can approach new transitions with greater awareness. If we know how land conflicts developed, we can better understand modern disputes. History does not provide a perfect instruction manual, but it gives us a much larger map.
And that map is remarkably long. Human beings lived in North America for thousands of years before the United States was founded. The Republic itself has existed for only a fraction of that time. When viewed against the deep history of the continent, the modern nation is young. Its borders, institutions, and economic systems are recent arrangements within a much older human landscape. That perspective should produce humility. The United States is powerful, but power does not make a society permanent. Past societies were once confident in their own futures, too. Their cities, institutions, and economic systems eventually changed. Modern America will also change. The question is not whether change will happen, but how people will respond to it.
The future may bring new forms of energy, new transportation, new patterns of migration, new technologies, and new political arrangements. Artificial intelligence may change the organization of work. Climate change may alter settlement and agriculture. Demographic changes may transform cities and institutions. Global economic competition may reshape industries. None of these changes will happen in isolation. They will interact with the historical structures inherited from the past. The people living through those changes will not know exactly how history will judge them. The same was true of people in every earlier period. A farmer in the 19th century did not know that the railroad would transform the country. A factory worker did not know that automation would change manufacturing. A researcher working on early computer networks could not fully predict the internet economy. History is often visible only after the fact.
That is why the ordinary decisions of the present matter. The future is built through policies, inventions, investments, migrations, family choices, educational decisions, and cultural changes. Large historical transformations emerge from countless smaller actions. The people who shape history are not always famous. Most of them are ordinary people whose combined choices create new social realities. The final lesson of American history may therefore be less about greatness than about continuity. The United States was built on layers of older societies, older cultures, older economies, and older landscapes. It continues to evolve because new generations inherit those layers and reinterpret them. The country of the future will not simply repeat the country of the past. It will transform what it inherits. Imagine the camera rising above North America. Below it are modern cities, highways, farms, forests, deserts, rivers, and coastlines. Beneath those visible features are older railroads, colonial roads, abandoned industrial sites, indigenous settlements, ancient earthworks, and archaeological layers. The map becomes a timeline. Every place contains more history than can be seen from the surface. The Mississippi still flows south. The Great Lakes still connect the interior to the Atlantic world. The mountains still define routes and climates. The deserts still shape settlement. The Pacific and Atlantic still frame the continent. The physical landscape has witnessed the arrival and departure of countless generations. Political borders are temporary lines drawn across a much older geography. Long before the word America described a nation, the continent already had its own human geography. People knew rivers by names that may not survive in modern maps. Communities recognized mountains as landmarks and sacred places. Trails connected villages and hunting grounds. Trade routes crossed ecological boundaries. The land was already organized through human memory. When European colonization began, another geography was placed on top of that older one. New maps, roads, towns, forts, plantations, farms, ports, and political boundaries appeared. Later, railroads and highways added new layers. Modern cities added another. None of these layers completely erased what came before. Archaeology and memory continue to reveal the older landscapes. The United States, therefore, cannot be understood only through its presidents, wars, and constitutions. Those are important,
But they are part of a much larger story involving ecosystems, migration, family life, labor, technology, culture, and ordinary people. The national story is made from thousands of smaller stories. The ancient past also prevents us from assuming that modern political institutions are the only possible form of social organization. Indigenous nations developed alliances and political systems of their own. Large ceremonial centers organized labor without modern bureaucracies. Trade networks connected distant communities without modern corporations. These examples broaden our understanding of what human societies can create.
The colonial period shows how rapidly societies can change when previously separate worlds become connected. Disease, trade, animals, weapons, religion, and economic demand altered North America within generations. The Industrial Revolution later accelerated change even further. The Digital Revolution accelerated it again. The pace of historical transformation has itself become a historical phenomenon. Yet even during rapid change, old patterns persist. Families remain important. Communities continue to form around shared identity. People still seek security and opportunity. Political conflicts still revolve around power and resources. New technologies change the form of these struggles, but rarely eliminate them entirely.
How should different communities coexist? What responsibilities does one generation have to the next? How should technology be used? These questions have no final answer. A long view of history also shows that no generation owns the future. Every generation inherits decisions made by earlier people and then makes new decisions of its own. The people who built railroads did not control how later generations would use them. The scientists who created early computers did not control the internet. The founders of the Republic could not predict the modern country. The future always exceeds the intentions of the people who create it. The same will be true of our time. We are building systems whose consequences may continue long after we are gone. Some will become ordinary infrastructure. Others may disappear. Some decisions will be praised, others criticized. But all of them will become part of the historical layer inherited by future generations.
If there is one image that can summarize the entire journey, it is a landscape seen from above. At first, it appears empty. Then, as the camera moves closer, traces of human life appear. A mound, a settlement, a trail, a field, a road, a railroad, a city, a highway, a data center. Each layer represents a different era. The landscape is never truly empty. It is full of accumulated human decisions. The story of the United States begins, therefore, not with a flag, a declaration, or a constitution. It begins with people. It begins with migration and adaptation. It grows through agriculture, trade, political organization, cultural exchange, and conflict. It changes through colonization, revolution, slavery, expansion, war, industrialization, immigration, reform, and technology. And it does not end in the present. The country continues to change because the people who live there continue to make choices. New communities form, old industries disappear, new technologies emerge, political institutions are challenged and adjusted, cultural identities evolve, the landscape itself changes. Perhaps the most important lesson is that history should not be reduced to a simple rise from the past into the present. History is more like a river. It changes direction, widens, narrows, divides, joins other streams, and carries material from one period into another. The United States is one enormous historical river fed by many smaller streams. Indigenous history, European colonization, African American history, immigration, labor, technology, agriculture, war, and global exchange. Each stream matters. Remove indigenous history, and the geography of America becomes incomprehensible. Remove slavery and African American history, and the economy and political development become incomprehensible. Remove immigration, and the growth of cities and industries becomes incomprehensible. Remove technology, and modern economic power becomes incomprehensible. Remove geography,
and the entire pattern of expansion becomes harder to explain. The complete story is therefore necessarily complicated. Complexity is not a weakness in historical storytelling. It is the evidence that real societies are made of many interacting forces. A simple story may be easier to remember, but a complex story is often closer to the truth. As the camera slowly pulls farther away, individual buildings disappear. Cities become points of light. State borders become invisible. Eventually, the entire continent becomes a shape surrounded by ocean. From that distance, the political boundaries seem temporary. What remains visible is the land and the human movement across it. That is the deepest perspective from which to understand America. The nation is young compared with the continent's human history. Its institutions are important, but they are not eternal. Its culture is powerful, but it is constantly changing. Its economy is enormous, but it depends on global networks and natural resources. Its future will depend on choices that have not yet been made.
The ancient inhabitants of North America could not imagine the cities that would eventually cover parts of the continent. The settlers of the colonial era could not imagine the industrial economy. The founders of the Republic could not imagine the internet. Industrial workers could not imagine smartphones and artificial intelligence. Each generation lived inside a world that seemed normal to them, while the future was almost impossible to see. We live inside the same uncertainty. The world around us feels permanent because it is the world we know. But history tells us that permanence is often an illusion. The buildings, technologies, political arrangements, and economic systems of today may look very different to people living centuries from now.
That is not a reason for pessimism. It is a reason for responsibility. If societies change, then choices matter. If institutions can be rebuilt, then people can influence the direction of change. History shows both the costs of destructive decisions and the possibilities created by reform, cooperation, invention, and courage. The story of America contains failures that should not be romanticized and achievements that should not be ignored. It contains violence and creativity, exclusion and reform, exploitation and innovation, conflict and cooperation. These contradictions are not accidental details. They are part of the country's historical structure. To understand the United States is therefore to understand how different people experience the same landscape in different ways. For one person, the frontier meant opportunity. For another, it meant dispossession. For one worker, a factory meant a stable wage. For another, it meant dangerous conditions. For one immigrant, a city meant freedom. For another, it meant poverty and discrimination. History becomes meaningful when these perspectives are allowed to coexist. The same principle applies to the future. A new technology may look like opportunity to one group and disruption to another. A new economic policy may create growth for some and insecurity for others. A new migration pattern may enrich cultural life while creating pressure on housing and institutions. The challenge is not to eliminate change, which is impossible, but to manage change in ways that create broader opportunities and reduce unnecessary harm. This has been the long story of North America and the United States. People adapting to environments, communities forming and changing, institutions growing, cultures meeting, technologies transforming daily life, and political ideas expanding and being challenged. The story stretches far beyond any single leader or event. When the final image appears, the lights of modern America remain visible below. Somewhere beneath those lights are the traces of ancient communities. Somewhere beneath modern roads are older paths. Somewhere beneath modern cities are the remains of earlier settlements. The past has not vanished. It has become part of the ground on which the present stands. The oldest layer of the story is human movement. People arrived, adapted, settled, moved again, and built relationships. Thousands of years later, people still move for safety, opportunity, family, and hope. The reasons are not completely different. The scale and technology are different,
but the human impulse remains recognizable.
The next layer is cooperation. No society survives through isolated individuals. Ancient communities cooperated to grow food, build structures, trade, and defend themselves. Modern societies cooperate through schools, governments, businesses, scientific institutions, transportation systems, and digital networks. The systems are larger, but the principle is the same. Complex societies depend on coordination. Another layer is conflict. Scarce resources, competing political goals, cultural differences, and unequal power produce disputes. Sometimes those disputes are resolved through negotiation. Sometimes they become violent. American history contains both examples. The challenge for every generation is to build institutions capable of resolving disagreements without destroying the society itself. The final layer is memory. Societies decide what to remember, what to celebrate, what to criticize, and what to teach. Historical memory influences identity. If a country remembers only victories, it may repeat old mistakes. If it remembers only failures, it may overlook genuine achievements. A mature society needs a history large enough to contain both. The United States is still writing that history. Every election, invention, migration, protest, scientific discovery, business decision, cultural movement, and family choice adds another line. Future historians will connect those lines into patterns that we cannot yet see. Perhaps that is the most honest ending for a story about American development. There is no final ending. There is only a present moment inside a much longer process. The ancient past remains beneath us, the modern world surrounds us, and the future is still unwritten.
From the first human footsteps to the lights of modern cities, North America has witnessed thousands of years of adaptation and transformation. The United States is one chapter in that immense story. It is a remarkable chapter, but it is not the whole book. The continent was old before the nation was born. Its rivers, mountains, forests, deserts, and coastlines existed before political borders. Its indigenous societies created their own histories long before European colonization. Later generations added new layers of culture, conflict, technology, and institutions. Each generation inherited a world it did not create, and then changed it for those who came after. That is the enduring lesson of the American story. The present is never created from nothing. It is inherited, transformed, challenged, and passed forward. The people of the past could not see the world we live in, just as we cannot see the world that future generations will inhabit. But we are connected by the choices we leave behind. The camera rises one last time. The continent becomes smaller. Cities become lights. Rivers become thin lines. The borders fade. The landscape remains. And beneath the modern surface, thousands of years of human history continue to speak through archaeology, memory, language, culture, and the people who still live on the land today. The story continues because history never truly stops. A society changes, another generation arrives, and a new chapter begins. The ancient world became the colonial world. The colonial world became the republic. The republic became an industrial nation. The industrial nation became a global power. The global power became a digital society. Whatever comes next will be built from everything that came before. And so, the story of America is ultimately a story about change. Change in land, population, technology, institutions, culture, and ideas. It is a story of opportunity and cost, ambition and consequence, conflict and cooperation. Most importantly, it is a story made by people. Before America had a name, people lived here. After America became a nation, people continued to reshape it. And tomorrow, new generations will continue the work. The final image is not a monument or a battlefield. It is a landscape at dawn. A river moves quietly through the continent. A city begins to wake. Somewhere, a farmer starts a day of work. Somewhere, a student opens a computer. Somewhere, a family prepares breakfast. Somewhere, a community preserves an ancient tradition. These ordinary moments are the continuation of a history that began thousands of years ago. The United States did not appear suddenly, and it will not remain unchanged forever. It emerged from a much older North American world and continues to evolve within it. To understand its development is to understand the people who came before, the institutions they built, the conflicts they created, the ideas they challenged, and the possibilities they left for those who came after.
The story has no perfect ending, because history itself has no perfect ending. There are only new questions, new choices, and new generations. The past gives us the evidence. The present gives us responsibility. The future remains open.